The Stardust Tavern sat at the edge of civilization on Terran, a backwater human colony that had long since lost its place on any important star charts. It was the kind of place where wanderers and outlaws nursed their drinks in silence, and the few who spoke did so in hushed tones. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, scorched plasma residue, and the faint metallic tang of a world barely clinging to life. Jonathan Harris moved behind the counter with the ease of a man who had spent decades serving drinks, offering wisdom, and, on occasion, breaking up fights with nothing more than a glance. His once broad shoulders had slumped with age, and silver streaked his beard, but his hands were steady as they polished a glass. A soldier sat hunched over at the bar, his uniform tattered, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Colonel Ivan Merrick, a relic of old wars, had made the Stardust Tavern his second home, drowning ghosts in bottomless glasses. "You ever wonder," Ivan said, swirling the amber liquid in his cup, "if we got it wrong? Maybe it was better before we reached the stars." John smirked, placing a fresh bottle in front of him. "If you're talking about before we ran into the Romagians, maybe. But I'd take a hard drink and bad company over dying in a ditch back on Earth." Ivan huffed a laugh, but didn't argue. The galaxy hadn't been kind to humanity. The Romajan Empire, an advanced alien dominion, had crushed them before they could establish a foothold among the stars. Humans had become second-class citizens, their colonies little more than tributaries to a foreign power. The doors to the tavern hissed open. Conversations stilled. A group of Romajan soldiers strode in, their sleek exo-armor glinting under the low lights. At their center, standing with the arrogance of a man who never feared consequence, was Captain Zyros Valkon. John's fingers tightened around the glass in his hand, but he kept his face blank. He'd seen Zyros before, knew the type, the kind who mistook power for permanence. The Romajan soldiers spread out, their hands resting on the hilts of energy blades, rifles slung across their backs. The patrons shifted, warily eyeing the intruders, but saying nothing. Zyros stepped up to the counter, tapping his gloved fingers on the wood. "Jonathan Harris." His voice was smooth, practiced. "I hear you've been slow on your contributions to the Empire." John wiped his hands on a rag and set it aside. "I pay what's fair. Your lot's just decided fair ain't good enough." Zyros smiled, sharp teeth flashing beneath violet lips. "Fair is what we say it is. And you, an old man running a drinking hole, should know better than to test that." John stared at him, unblinking. He had been a soldier once, had seen men like Zyros crumble when their power was stripped away. But there was no army at John's back, no war to fight. Just a bar, and a legacy barely worth remembering. "I'm too old to care about threats," John said. "You want to shake down someone, find another mark. I'm done paying for a protection that doesn't protect anyone." Silence. The kind that stretches thin and tight, where even the air itself waits to see what comes next. Zyros sighed and signaled to his men. A soldier grabbed John by the collar and hauled him over the counter. The room exploded into movement. Chairs scraped, hands went for weapons, but the Romagians were faster. A sharp energy burst crackled through the room, and everyone froze. John was on his knees, breathing heavy, as Zyros knelt beside him. "You misunderstand, human," Zyros whispered. "This isn't a request. This is the natural order." John spat at his feet. "Nature's got nothing to do with cowards who need an army to make themselves feel big." Zyros's expression flickered, irritation replacing amusement. "You should have kept your mouth shut." The shot was sudden, brutal. A searing plasma round tore through John's chest, his body jolting before he slumped forward. The patrons recoiled, horror and fury trapped beneath the weight of self-preservation. Zyros stood, brushing imaginary dust from his uniform. "Let this be a lesson to those who forget their place." He turned to Ivan, who hadn't moved from his stool, his grip white-knuckled on his glass. "You look like a man who knows better." Ivan's gaze was molten steel, but he said nothing. Zyros chuckled. Smart. He motioned for his soldiers to follow as they stepped over John's body and out the door. The hiss of the airlock was the only sound that followed them. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ivan set his drink down, sliding off the stool and kneeling beside John. The old bartender's chest barely rose, his breath a ragged whisper. Ivan leaned in. John. The bartender's fingers curled weakly, gripping the front of Ivan's coat. His eyes, dimming but not yet gone, locked onto Ivan's with an intensity that should have been impossible. They don't know, John rasped, each word a battle. They don't know what they've done. His grip loosened. His eyes emptied. His body stilled. Ivan closed his eyes, inhaling sharply before standing. The bar remained silent, a collective grief settling over it like a storm. But grief was a temporary thing. Anger, however, anger burned forever. A soft beep echoed through the room. A comm device, flashing red. Ivan pulled it from his pocket, staring at the sender. Dante Harris. For years, no one had spoken his name without caution. A myth, a shadow that loomed over those foolish enough to cross him. Ivan swallowed. He had no doubt the message contained only one thing. A single inquiry, unspoken but absolute. Who? Ivan exhaled slowly, staring down at John's lifeless form. He pressed a single button, sending back the only answer that mattered. Zyros Valkon. The device went dark. The silence stretched longer this time, heavier than before. But now it carried something else. Something raw, something inevitable. The storm was coming, and it would not be merciful. The ship cut through the void like a blade, silent and swift, its hull painted in the black of a starless night. It bore no insignia, no registration code, nothing to mark it as belonging to any known faction. It was a ghost, moving unseen through the galaxy's arteries, driven by a single purpose. Inside, the pilot sat in stillness, his hands resting on the controls, though he scarcely needed them. The ship knew its master's will. It would take him where he needed to go. Dante Harris had spent years outside the reaches of polite society. The name he had once carried belonged to a different life, to the son of a man who had tried to make a home in a world that refused him one. That man was gone, buried beneath the weight of choices Dante had made long ago. But there was one thing left, something even the passage of time could not take from him. Blood demanded blood. His father had been a good man. He had left war behind, turned his hands to something quieter, something that let him build instead of destroy. It had been a foolish dream. The universe did not reward kindness. It devoured it. And the Romajan filth who had killed him would learn that the hard way. Terran loomed in the viewport, an ugly little planet barely worth the effort it took to reach it. Dante guided the ship into its atmosphere, gliding through darkened skies until the Stardust Tavern appeared below. He landed with precision, silent as a predator slipping into its hunting ground. As he descended the ramp, the night air pressed against him, thick with the scent of dust and something burnt. The tavern doors whispered open. Inside, the air was heavier, stale with the presence of men who had not yet shaken off their grief. Eyes turned toward him, some widening in recognition, others darting away. They knew. Of course they knew. Ivan Marek was the only one who didn't look away. He sat at the same stool as always, an untouched drink in front of him. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were clear. When Dante stepped forward, Ivan didn't speak. He simply reached into his coat, withdrew a small data chip, and set it on the counter. Dante picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. Zyros Valkon, Ivan said. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it. A warning, maybe? He didn't just kill John. He wanted to make an example of him. Dante's grip tightened, the chip pressing into his palm. Where? Ivan exhaled slowly. Imperial outpost on Eros 9. High security. Reinforcements every 12 hours. He won't be alone. Dante's silence was answer enough. Ivan sighed, rubbing his temple. I know you won't listen, but I'll say it anyway. This isn't just some back-alley revenge job. The Romagians. They took my father, Dante cut in, his voice cold, measured. They took him like he was nothing. You expect me to let that stand? Ivan met his gaze, something unreadable flickering across his face. No. I expect you to make them regret it. Dante pocketed the chip and turned toward the exit. They'll know you're coming, Ivan called after him. Dante didn't stop walking. Good. The ship lifted off minutes later, its engines barely whispering against the wind as it carved its path toward the stars. Inside, Dante sat at a reinforced steel table, assembling his arsenal with practiced efficiency. Every weapon was chosen for a purpose: knives, pistols, an old-fashioned kinetic rifle that had once belonged to a human warlord feared across the Outer Rim. It would do. His father had never liked weapons. He'd always said a man should solve his problems with his words first. Dante had tried, once, to be the son his father wanted. It hadn't worked. The universe didn't listen to words. It listened to violence. Eros 9 was more fortress than outpost, an ironclad monstrosity floating in the abyss, encased in layers of security meant to keep threats at bay. Dante studied it from a distance, watching patrol patterns, tracking shift rotations, noting the weak points where a single man could slip through the cracks. He didn't rush. Revenge wasn't about anger. It was about patience. A stolen Imperial clearance code got him past the first layer of security. A well-placed bribe had seen to the second. The third was trickier, an automated drone patrol designed to shoot first and ask questions never. But Dante had slipped past worse things. He moved like a shadow, quiet as the grave, weaving through the blind spots with a precision that came from years of practice. Inside, the corridors were cold, sterile, humming with a quiet thrum of machinery and the occasional echo of boots against steel. Romajan soldiers patrolled in pairs, confident in their own security. That confidence would be their downfall. The first kill was silent. A blade slipped between armor plates, severing the spine before the soldier could make a sound. Dante lowered the body to the ground, slipping into the dead man's uniform. It wasn't perfect. He was taller than most Romagians, broader in the shoulders, but it would be enough to get him where he needed to go. Zyros's quarters were near the command center, behind layers of biometric locks and reinforced walls. But security could be bypassed. Walls could be breached. The second kill was just as quiet as the first. The third wasn't. A guard rounded the corner at the wrong time. Dante's knife flashed, but not before the soldier let out a strangled cry. The alarms shrieked to life, and the hunt truly began. Dante moved fast, weaving through the corridors, cutting down anyone in his path. Blood splattered against the walls. Bodies crumpled in his wake. The Romagians had numbers, but numbers didn't matter when the enemy was faster, deadlier, and completely unafraid to die. Security turrets activated, tracking his movement, but he was already ahead of them. A detonator planted seconds earlier sent the system into a cascade failure, sparks flying as the automated defenses collapsed. He pressed forward. Zyros would be running now. Dante reached the upper levels, stepping into the captain's private chambers. The room was opulent by military standards, decorations stolen from conquered worlds, a collection of fine weaponry displayed on the walls. But Zyros was nowhere to be seen. A console flashed on the desk, a recorded message already playing. You must be the son. Dante's breath slowed, his hands steady at his sides. Zyros's voice was calm, almost amused. I knew someone would come. I was hoping it would be you. Your father was a stubborn old fool, and I imagine you take after him. Dante stepped forward, fingers brushing over the desk. You'll find I'm not so easily cornered, Zyros continued. By the time you hear this, I'll be gone. Run, chase, do whatever it is humans do when they think vengeance will make them whole. But know this, your kind lost this war a long time ago. One man will not change that. The message ended. Dante stood in the silence, the rage within him a quiet, burning thing. Zyros thought running would save him. He thought distance was protection. He was wrong. Dante turned, stepping over the bodies in the hall, moving with the certainty of a man who had never once lost his prey. The ship Dante had stolen was barely holding together, its thrusters sputtering in protest as he pushed them to their limits. Eros 9 was behind him, reduced to a graveyard of Romajan bodies and shattered security systems. The alarms would still be wailing, soldiers scrambling to make sense of the massacre that had taken place in their halls. But by the time the Empire understood what had hit them, Dante would be somewhere else, already hunting. Zyros had slipped through his fingers, but it didn't matter. The mistake had been made the moment the Romajan captain chose to run. A man running left footprints. A man running made noise. A man running became prey. Dante leaned back in his seat, hands steady on the controls, his mind calculating the next move. He had carved his path through Eros 9, dismantled its defenses, broken its command structure, and left a message that no one would mistake. The Empire had always seen humans as an inconvenience, an inferior species destined for subjugation. Now, they would know what it meant to fear one. The comm unit on his dashboard flickered to life. "You're making enemies," Ivan's voice came through low and tired. Dante didn't respond immediately. He knew Ivan had a point. The Romagians wouldn't let this slide. A station full of dead soldiers, a command center in flames, a missing captain. It was a declaration of war. "Where is he?" Dante asked, his voice cutting through the static. Ivan sighed on the other end. "I did some digging. Zyros is headed for Zarkesh Prime. It's a deep-core Imperial world. He won't be alone." Dante's fingers tapped against the control panel, considering. Zarkesh Prime was one of the Romajan Empire's strongholds, a fortress world protected by fleets and orbital defenses. If Zyros had gone there, it meant he was scared enough to put himself in the heart of Imperial security. "Good. You're walking into a hornet's nest," Ivan continued. "It won't be like Eros 9. You won't slip in unnoticed." Dante exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the star map. "I don't need to." The transmission ended. He adjusted his trajectory, engaging the ship's hyperdrive. The stars outside blurred into streaks of white light, the universe folding around him. He had always been patient, methodical, precise. But patience had its limits. Zarkesh Prime came into view hours later, a monolithic world of towering spires and heavy artillery. The Empire's banners flew high, draped across their warships, a testament to their supposed unshakable dominion. Dante had no intention of sneaking onto the planet. That wasn't the message he wanted to send. He launched the first strike before they even knew he was there. A barrage of torpedoes slammed into the nearest defense station, detonating in a cascade of fire and shattered metal. Alarms erupted across the sector, warships scrambling into formation, their gun batteries swiveling to lock onto his position. He wove between their fire, his ship a streak of darkness against the chaos, cutting through their defenses with precision. A squadron of Romajan fighters peeled off to intercept him, their sleek frames gliding through the void with lethal grace. Dante let them get close. Then he killed them. The stolen ship's weapon systems screamed to life, tearing through the enemy formation with rapid bursts of plasma fire. One by one, the fighters exploded, their remains scattering like burning debris against the planet's gravity well. Inside the command center of Zarkesh Prime, Zyros watched the battle unfold, his jaw tightening with every explosion that lit up the night sky. He had expected Dante to chase him, but this was madness. No man could take on an entire fleet alone. And yet he was. Zyros turned to his officers, barking orders. Deploy ground forces. Set planetary lockdown protocols. I want every available unit on high alert. He could feel it, the weight pressing down on his chest. The fear. Dante's ship streaked through the upper atmosphere, its hull scorched from the fight, its engines burning with everything they had left. He wasn't here for a siege. He was here to cut the head from the snake. The impact was brutal. The ship crashed into the outer district of the Imperial compound, skidding through metal and stone, its fuselage torn apart by the force of its descent. The dust settled. Silence reigned. Then Dante stepped out. His body ached, blood trickled from a cut along his temple, but he barely registered it. He holstered a plasma rifle over his shoulder, checked the knives strapped to his belt, and set his sights on the fortress ahead. Soldiers swarmed toward him, their weapons raised, their orders clear. Kill him. He met them head-on. The first shots rang out, streaks of plasma slicing through the air. Dante moved before they landed, his body weaving through the chaos, his rifle spitting death with every pull of the trigger. The first wave fell before they understood what was happening. The second lasted only seconds longer. He was unstoppable. A blade flashed toward him. He caught the wrist, twisted, drove his knife into the soldier's throat, and let the body drop. Another lunged. He sidestepped, disarmed, broke bone, ended it. His movements were fluid, lethal, honed by years of violence. He carved his way through the compound, a force of nature given form. The alarm screamed, warning of an intruder, but the warning meant nothing. He was already inside. Zyros stood in the command center, watching the security feeds in horror. The elite forces of the Empire, slaughtered like cattle. His men, his war machines, reduced to corpses and burning wreckage. It wasn't possible. It wasn't human. A voice crackled through the comm, "Sir, we can't hold him. He's..." A scream cut short. Silence. Zyros' heart pounded against his ribs. He turned to his personal guard, a cadre of Romajan warriors trained in combat since birth. Kill him. They moved out, weapons gleaming in the artificial light, their expressions unreadable. Dante walked through the last corridor, blood on his hands, fire in his eyes. He had reached the heart of the beast. He had come to finish it. The guard stepped into his path. Good. They fought in silence, the clash of steel and plasma filling the air. The Romagians were strong, fast, disciplined. It didn't matter. Dante was better. One by one they fell. The last of them staggered back, clutching at a wound that gushed deep violet blood. He looked at Dante, at the man who had killed his entire unit without hesitation. Dante's expression never changed. He put a bullet between the soldier's eyes. Then there was nothing left between him and Zyros. The captain had locked himself in his office, his hands shaking as he clutched a sidearm. The door burst open, the force of the impact sending splinters of reinforced steel across the floor. Dante stepped in. Zyros aimed, fired. Dante didn't stop. A knife buried itself into Zyros' shoulder, pinning him to the wall. He screamed, his grip loosening, his weapon clattering to the floor. Dante loomed over him, his presence suffocating, his gaze empty. He reached forward, gripped Zyros by the throat, and dragged him forward. "You should have stayed and fought," Dante said, voice quiet. Zyros choked, his body trembling. Please?" Dante leaned in. "Did my father beg?" The captain's eyes widened. Dante wrenched the knife free, letting Zyros collapse to the ground, gasping. He didn't move as he raised his pistol. One shot. Zyros stopped breathing. Dante exhaled, slow and steady. The fight was over, but the war had only just begun. He turned, stepping over the body, moving through the compound without looking back. The Empire had bled tonight, and it would bleed again. The fires of Zarkesh Prime burned long after the last shot had been fired. Smoke coiled into the darkened sky, the scent of charred metal and scorched flesh mixing with the stillness of the aftermath. The Empire had thought itself untouchable. It had believed in its invincibility, in the weight of its dominion, in the fear it instilled across the stars. But now, in the hushed corridors of its mightiest stronghold, that illusion lay shattered. Dante Harris stepped out of the war-torn command center, his boots slick with blood, his breath measured. His mind was still locked in the rhythm of violence, his pulse slow, controlled. The weight of the past hours lingered in his bones, but there was no relief. He hadn't come for relief. He had come for an ending. Zyros was dead. The architect of his father's murder had choked on his last breath, realizing too late that his power had been nothing but borrowed time. But Dante wasn't naive. Zyros had been a symptom, not the disease. The Romajan Empire was still out there, still ruling, still subjugating, still believing that humanity was something to be managed, to be kept under control. That belief had cost them tonight. Soon it would cost them everything. A metallic groan echoed through the compound, the structural integrity faltering from the destruction he had wrought. Dante moved through the carnage like a shadow, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, his focus unbroken. He had to leave, not because he feared what would come next, but because he intended to be the one to bring it. The dockyard was in chaos. Romajan officers barked orders, scrambling to coordinate a counterattack, but there was no plan, no cohesion. Fear had cracked their foundation. The ships waiting on the landing pads were all that remained of their once meticulous order. Dante picked the fastest one. The cockpit lit up under his hands, the engine roaring as he diverted power to the launch sequence. The air filled with the high-pitched wail of sirens as the Empire finally understood what was happening. Gunfire pinged against the hull as soldiers opened fire, but it was too late. The ship lifted off, burning through the atmosphere like a comet. As he broke through the clouds, a transmission crackled through his comm. "You just declared war." Ivan's voice was steady, but Dante could hear the weight behind it. The Romagians had already sent out an alert, their fleets mobilizing, their leaders preparing their retaliation. Zarkesh Prime had been an act of retribution, but it had also been something more. A warning. Dante activated the comm, his voice as cold as the space stretching out before him. "They started a war the moment they put my father's body on that counter." Ivan exhaled through the line. "There's no coming back from this." There was never a way back. Silence. Then, "Where'd you go now?" Dante glanced at the NAV screen, watching as dozens of Romajan ships moved into formation across the system. He had forced their hand. They weren't afraid of one man. Not yet. The ship's coordinates locked in. Dante set his course. "The heart of the Empire," he said. The hyperdrive engaged, the ship vanishing into the void. Word of Zarkesh Prime traveled faster than light. The destruction of the command center, the death of Captain Zyros, the bodies littering the halls of what had once been a fortress. It spread across the Empire like wildfire. The Romagians whispered among themselves, uncertain, unsettled. A single human had done this. The Senate convened in haste. The high-ranking officials of the Romajan Dominion gathering in the luminous halls of the Imperial Core. The Emperor himself sat at the head of the chamber, his elongated form coiled in his throne of polished obsidian. His advisors spoke in panicked voices, their words a storm of fear and fury. "This is unacceptable," one snarled. "A rogue assassin cannot be allowed to challenge the authority of the Empire." "He has already done more than that," another countered. "Zarkesh Prime was a demonstration of his intent. He isn't just taking revenge. He is hunting us. We must crush him before he emboldens others," a third added. "Humanity is already restless. If they see him as a symbol, we will face uprisings across our colonies." The Emperor had been silent, his golden eyes reflecting the dim glow of the chamber. He had lived long enough to know that fear was a tool, one he had wielded for centuries. But fear, when placed in the wrong hands, became something else. Dante Harris had become something else. The Emperor leaned forward. "Find him. Kill him. Burn every trace of him from existence." The orders were given. The hunt began. Dante arrived at the Imperial Core 3 days later. The world was a Leviathan, a planet-spanning metropolis of towering spires and endless networks of ships and stations. It was the heart of the Romajan Dominion, the place where their leaders made decisions that decided the fate of species across the galaxy. Dante infiltrated the outer districts first, slipping through security checkpoints with practiced ease. He had always been good at getting where he wasn't supposed to be, but stealth had never been his true weapon. Terror was. The first attack was precise. A senator's personal transport exploded on the first night, its wreckage raining down upon the city below. The second came hours later, when the head of the Imperial Intelligence Division was found in his private quarters, with his throat cut. The Empire had spent years believing itself untouchable. Dante was proving them wrong. Security tightened, patrols tripled, but it didn't matter. He moved through their defenses like a phantom, striking where they were weakest, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. They began to whisper his name, not in contempt, not in disdain, but in fear. And then, finally, they sent their best. Dante was waiting. The Imperial Guard descended upon him in the lower districts, a dozen elite Romajan warriors clad in darkened armor, moving with precision honed through centuries of warfare. They surrounded him in a dimly lit corridor, their weapons gleaming in the artificial glow. One of them stepped forward. "You are Dante Harris." Dante rolled his shoulders, his fingers flexing at his sides. "That's what they say." The warrior tilted his head. "You cannot win." Dante exhaled. "I don't need to win." The fight was over in minutes. They had strength, they had numbers, they had centuries of training. It wasn't enough. Dante left them broken, their bodies sprawled in the streets, their blood staining the metal beneath them. The Empire's last defense shattered. The palace doors were open. He entered the throne room with measured steps, his presence filling the space with something heavier than violence. The Emperor sat waiting, his golden eyes meeting Dante's without flinching. "You are persistent," the Emperor said. "You made this happen," Dante replied. The Emperor studied him, fingers steepled. "Killing me will not erase what has been done." "No," Dante agreed. "But it will make sure it never happens again." The Emperor stood, his towering form moving with inhuman grace. "I have ruled for centuries. Empires do not fall to single men." Dante drew his weapon. "Then you don't understand men?" The shot echoed through the chamber. The Emperor fell, and with him, the Empire. The stars felt different. Dante stood on the bridge of his ship, watching as the Imperial Core burned behind him. The war would not end overnight. The remnants of the Empire would fight. They would struggle. They would claw for what little power they had left. But they had already lost. The story would spread. The legend of the man who had torn down an empire, brick by brick, body by body. Humanity would rise. The Romagians would never rule them again. Ivan's voice crackled through the calm. "So what now?" Dante looked out into the endless expanse of space. "They took everything from me," he said. "Now I take everything from them." He set a new course. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet.